Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining our event today. Before we get started, I need to make you all aware of a few housekeeping points. Firstly, we have muted all of your lines and your videos will remain off for the duration of the session. However, there will be a chance to interact with Philip and John by using the Q&A function to submit any questions. The chat function is disabled for today's session, so please just use the Q&A function. We will have some time at the end of the session to put these questions to them. Please also note that this event is being recorded. Moving on to today's session, I'm delighted to welcome former ANO Special Global Counsel Philip Wood KC and ANO alum John Fisher. Last year, John and Philip's session, Understanding the Current Battle of Legal Ideologies Worldwide from Their History, explained how, generally speaking, the concepts in all of the world's 320 jurisdictions come from Roman law. Reference was made as to how the Romans had many accomplishments, but they were all eclipsed by law and Christianity. In this session, John will talk about the enormous impact of these two achievements on the modern world. He will discuss the impact of commercial law on civilization and how the Romans really created Christianity, not only as a world religion, but as the foundation of Western civilization. Philip will then discuss how law began to take over and how from the 1830s onwards, it started to develop from these Roman law concepts. I will submit any questions that come through to Philip and John at the end, and I will now hand over to you both. Thank you. John, I think you're on mute.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Stella, for inviting Philip and me to give this talk. My talk is divided into the following headings as set out in the slide: jurisprudence, commercial law, Christianity in Roman times, could the collapse of the Roman Empire have been avoided, and finally, the importance of Christianity to civilization after the fall of the Roman Empire. We all admire Roman architecture, civil engineering, classical texts, etc. However, the two most important achievements Rome left us were none of these but law and Christianity. Civilization comes from the Latin civitas. You cannot have a city without a legal code. Generally speaking, all 320 jurisdictions in the world are based on Justinian's Digest of 533 AD, as it provides law's fundamental architecture. Most important being how a court establishes jurisdiction by a defendant appearing before it, and the method of working out the law through case studies. Justinian's Digest has thousands of them. Other concepts include court procedure and the enforcement of judgments. All the principles in English law in Latin, offering acceptance from the early Roman contract of stipulatiae, contract and conveyance of legal title in land and goods, including intangible properties such as computer software, through the Roman invention of the assignment, trust, negligence, and other torts. If this one copy of the Digest had not been found in 1070 at Amalfi in Italy, after being lost for 500 years, the world's law would be very different. Generally speaking, all 320 jurisdictions are based on this one copy, which is now in Florence. The Roman jurists are much more analytical than we are. We have merged contract and conveyance of legal title in goods. The Romans kept them separate. Take the Supply of Goods and Services Act 1982. Here we have also merged the sale of goods and services. However, the Romans had a separate sale and a hire contract format. The hire contract included not only the hire of goods, but also leases of property, hire of services, and employment law. It makes it so much easier to analyse these concepts if they are kept separate. With the establishment of cities came a great growth in population and therefore services. Rome at its height had a huge population, whereas Athens' population at its height was tiny. Services had to be paid for. Barter will not work, hence the need for a money economy. You cannot have a money economy without law. There were other legal codes both before and after the Romans. The Greeks had a legal code, as did the barbarian states that followed the collapse of the Roman Empire. However, primitive is what all these legal codes have in common, and that is why they failed. Why is it that only a very detailed legal code, as in Justinian's Digest, 1.5 times the size of the Bible, succeeded? The answer was provided by Cicero prior to 46 BC. in his work called De Legibus, when he said that people will only obey a moral law. The law is immoral, they will not obey it. Of necessity, this must be complex. There is no point in having a legal system if nobody will obey it. Law must be voluntarily obeyed. There are not enough policemen in the world to enforce law. We can ascertain what Cicero considered to be morality from his surviving writings. He was right at least 43 years before the birth of Christ, so it was certainly not Christian morality. After all, Cicero owned slaves. A slave was property in Roman law. Fundamental to Cicero was that the law respected property rights. Cicero believed that civil law must be based on natural law, which is a body of norms or principles inherent in all of us. If civil law was not, then it was invalid and nobody would obey it. If we translate Cicero's ideas of morality into modern terms, it is probably something like a moral code based on expected or acceptable conduct. It took until 1961 for Hubert Hart in his book, Concept of Law, to identify this as the reason law was voluntarily obeyed. When you ask a layman about law, you'll understandably only think of criminal law. Criminal law is important, but it is a tiny part of law which is gigantic. Far more important to civilization is commercial law, for above all else, law protects property rights. In commercial law today, we must consider international finance. One does not want to be too breathless and wide-eyed about the amounts involved in international finance. However, they are huge. To get one's bearings, one may imagine a piece of graph paper, which is a metre square and therefore representing a million. A billion is the same metre of graph paper, but stretched a kilometre to the side, just over half a mile. A trillion is the same square metre of graph paper, but stretched a kilometre to the side, and also a kilometre upwards, just over half a mile upwards. Thus, a billion is much bigger than a million, and a trillion is much, much bigger than a billion. Global gross domestic product, or the total value of all goods and services bought and sold in 2019, was probably about $77 trillion. Foreign exchange transactions on the major exchanges in the world are probably over $500 trillion a year. The turnover of electronic payments is over $1,500 trillion a year. These systems get through the total GDP of the world every 14 days. The total turnover of the face value of derivative contracts each year runs to hundreds of trillions of dollars. These are part of the billions of contracts entered into every day in the world. Generally speaking, all these contracts are legally binding, based on the concepts set out in Justinian's Digest and Cicero's De Legibus. The largest securities settlement system in the world holds American traders' securities worth over $27 trillion. That is about half of the world's GDP. It is called the Depository Trust Corporation. Euroclear, a securities settlement system in Brussels, holds securities worth more than 1.5 times the GDP of all EU countries. Settlement systems are effectively trusts, which derive from the Roman will trust called a fidei commissum. Fidei means trust and commissum means to commit, and thus denotes that something is committed to one's trust. When the above is considered, all other expressions of wealth may seem trivial. Indeed, it would have been if world governments had not stepped in to stop the implosion of derivative contracts and the credit crunch in 2008, as the world's banking system would have collapsed. Whilst law is necessary for civilization, in the past in extreme circumstances, it would not alone have held civilization together. Something else was required, and that was Christianity. When Christ said you must love your neighbour, this was revolutionary for the Gentile non-Jewish world. They all thought dog eats dog. Life for the majority of people was pretty grim. Christianity, with its moral code and promise of supernatural help in this world and eternal life in the next, appealed particularly to the dispossessed and downcast, i.e. the majority of people. Christians had hope, and Christianity spread like wildfire. When Constantine seized the emperor's throne in 312 AD at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, to rule the support of the Roman Christians, he had the Chi-Rho painted on his legion's shields. Chi-Rho are the first two letters of Christ in the Greek alphabet, i.e. Chi-Rho in the Greek alphabet is an X with a P down the middle, not the catchiest of brands. A red as opposed to a white cross on the legion's shields to give camouflage for night fighting would have been better. Emperor Constantine's support for the Christians did not end here. With no television or radio, talking about philosophy was a popular topic in bars and dinner parties in Roman society. Conversation became heated as opposing factions argued either that Christ and God were two or one person, with the Holy Ghost thrown in as a third party. The dispute in the church became serious when priest Arius and his followers argued that God was a separate individual from Christ and threatened a breakaway from the church. In an act of first-class statecraft, Emperor Constantine at the Council of Nicaea, as in Creed, not far from Constantinople, in 325 AD, settled this dispute by stating that God the Father and God the Son was one person. The Holy Ghost was recognized as part of the Trinity, but questions about this were left to be resolved at the Council of Constantinople in 381 AD, convened by Emperor Theodosius. This now meant that Christ was alive every day of the week forever, and the spread of Christianity was unstoppable, not only through the Roman Empire, but also in barbarian lands. Christianity became the philosophy of life. In my view, if this simple concept had been more readily understood and expressed, many of the problems which the church encountered in history could have been avoided. For example, we would not have seen the tremendous decline in religion in my lifetime. Instead, religious preaching and practice went down many highways and byways, without these being tied into religion being the philosophy of life. Many people have pondered whether or not the Roman Empire's collapse could have been avoided. A large number of theories have been proposed, many of them based on the Senate having far more power over the emperor and the legions than it had. But would this have worked? As it has never worked even in our modern era. We can see this in Tony Blair's invasion of Iraq, where our institutions were incapable of stopping this country getting involved in an illegal war. In my view, a root cause of the collapse not only of the Roman Empire, but of most organizations throughout history, has been down to one thing: the ego of the leader getting out of control. Tacitus called it ruler's craze, such as an escalating narcissism and hubris likely to lead to nemesis. Lord David Owen, the former Labour Foreign Secretary, SDP leader and medical doctor, has identified ruler's craze in his book, In Sickness and in Power. He calls it the hubris syndrome. His long diagnosis of this mental illness includes narcissistic propensity to see the world primarily as an arena in which the ruler can exercise power and seek glory, rather than as a place with problems that need approaching in a pragmatic, non-self-referential manner, excessive confidence in their own judgment, and contempt for the advice or criticism of others, exaggerated self-belief, bordering on a sense of omnipotence in what they can personally achieve, restlessness, recklessness, and impulsiveness, loss of contact with reality, a type of incompetence in carrying out a policy which can be called hubristic incompetence. After the Third Punic War in 146 BC, and the subsequent defeat of Macedonia, leaving open the road to Egypt, the Roman generals became hugely powerful, many times more powerful than Tony Blair. They controlled vast and rich provinces. The money they were able to raise from selling slaves and levying taxes to pay their legions were of a scale that dwarfed Tony Blair's power. For example, after the Gallic Wars in 50 BC, Caesar ruled Gaul, encompassing present-day France, Belgium, Luxembourg, most of Switzerland, parts of northern Italy, and Germany west of the Rhine. This great power of the generals laid the ground for never-ending tilts at the throne of the Roman emperor, and eventually the downfall of the empire. For example, in 238 AD, Rome had 6 emperors, 5 of whom were murdered. They were not immune from ruler's craze. It afflicted the governor of Britannia, also called Constantine, who in a madcap scheme declared himself Emperor Constantine III in 407 AD and took the remaining legions to Gaul, where he was defeated and killed in 411 AD. The resulting collapse of civilization in England could have been avoided, but for Governor Constantine's ruler's craze. As an island, we were impregnable. Raising British legions would have been no problem. The Saxons could easily have been defeated. If so, our history would have been radically different. We would not have had the English language. President Trump would have been tweeting in Breton. Breton is similar to Brittonic, the native British language in Roman times. Many British fled to Brittany, France, to escape the Saxons. In my view, there is only one chance of avoiding the collapse of the Roman Empire. That was if the Red Cross of Christ was painted on the legion shields. Unfortunately, Emperor Constantine blew this chance. After seizing the throne, Constantine never again had even the Chi Rho, let alone a cross, painted on his legionary shields. Sovereigns whose only fundamental concern was holding on to power quickly realised the huge emotional hold of Christianity over their subjects. The concept of what is known to history as the donation of Constantine quickly gained ground even in barbarian lands, as their leaders converted to Christianity. With this concept, the leader gives the church all temporal power over the sovereign subjects in return for the church's permission for him to govern on its behalf. The church did not sell this right cheaply. For example, William the Conqueror obtained the church's support for invading England in 1066, in return for the church being granted 25% of all arable land. The chance of being seized by Emperor Constantine, and he made it known that he was the defender of the Christian religion, the Roman Empire may have been saved. The rapidly Christianizing barbarians had been faced in battle with a sea of Roman shields, all painted with a red cross of Christ defending Christianity. They may have had second thoughts about attacking. If so, the world would be very different today. Why is Christianity important to the modern world? In the fall of the priests and the rise of the lawyers, Philip explains that for over 1,500 years, religion held society together until the mid-1850s, when religion started to go out of fashion and law took over. In the 2 years of the Black Death from 1348, our population dropped from about 5 million to 3 million. Roughly 2 million of our population died, which was about 40%. The bubonic plague returned again and again, and by the end of the 17th century, 300 years later, our population was only about what it was before the Black Death. The recent COVID crisis is eerily similar to the Black Death in terms of where it came from, the speed of its travel, and the lack of cures at the time of its occurrence. The difference between the Black Death and COVID was that in 1348 and the following 300 years, religion held civilization together as the philosophy of life. Now we only have law. In his recent book, Do and Think, An Allegory for Survival, Philip uses music as an allegory for a philosophy of life actually put into practice. Religion and law have been the foundations of Western civilization. With this secure base, a person can do and think to survive so he can try to understand and achieve as much as possible. Music is an allegory of a person's journey through life, to feel at the end of the day it was all worthwhile. With religion out of fashion, we may have rejected this metaphysical belief system, but the desire for belief has neither been rejected nor has it disappeared. We still have beliefs, but we no longer know their shape or foundation. My good A&O friend John Scriven, in his book, Beyond the Odds, Providence in Britain's Wars of the 20th Century, explores turning points in the wars from the Christian perspective of the times. We must still love our neighbour to live in a city and have civilization. Now we only have law to give some structure, generally based on Justinian's Digest and Cicero's De Legibus. As an example, product liability created by Donahue and Stevenson in 1932 came from the Roman delict of negligence as set out in Justinian's Digest. Lord Atkins took the neighbour concept from the Bible to cover this up, as Roman law is not a source of English law. We have to hope law is sufficient to hold civilization together. If not, we may consciously have chosen to fail. Over to you, Philip.
Okay, well, thanks very much, John. That's amazing, and you certainly end on a large question, which I'm not sure that I'll be able to answer. You're right that I'm sure the Romans thought that their legacy was their incredibly efficient legions and their triumphal arches and their really magnificent monumental buildings and architecture. You know, they discovered concrete, which was a great help. But the fact is, it's law and religion, which is their legacy, one of them pure Roman, and the other from a corner of the empire, quite a far corner, actually. And those two overlapped quite a lot and still do. Anyway, you know, if you stand back a bit, over about 1,000 years, from round about 500 BC to 533, they moved away from a primitive legal system to an incredibly sophisticated set of legal concepts, which has influenced practically all the legal systems in the world today. which I think was a huge step up. So Roman law really had two lives. It had a life as a legal system governing the Roman Empire, and it had a life as a legal system which survived independently of the state, which created an ideology which hung in there and is still there, which is, quite an incredible achievement for one very beautiful but small little peninsula off the European peninsula. Now, what I'll first look at is what they were up against at the time. In other words, what was the who were the contemporary competitors? Because if you look at it from the point of view of the Romans in 476 AD, when the world seemed to be in ruins around them and was in fact in ruins, who would they have thought would succeed? They certainly wouldn't have thought that Roman law was going to succeed. And so if we look at what was there are about 3 or 4 classes of them. First of all, there were, of course, the religious codes. And one of those, the Quran, was developed in quite some detail after 632, about 100 years after Justinian. But if you compare the two, the Quran, as in all the religious books, were religious projects. They weren't really legal projects. And the content of the Quran, in terms of law, is actually quite small. And most of Islamic law, Sharia law, was developed about 3 centuries later in the 8th and 9th centuries. So that was very much smaller and not at all comprehensive as compared to the legal system. Christianity really had practically no law in it at all. Somehow they seem to say, well, all that's been dealt with by Isaiah and the previous prophets, and Christ just preached a message of loving kindness. Certainly, there were quite a lot of laws, in the Sermon on the Mount, but basically, it was a very novel religious project. Then you had the Hindu Dharma Sastras, which were composed initially in 100 AD, but were added to for several centuries afterwards. Then you had the Jewish books, the Torah, which is the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Mishnah of about 200 AD, and then the 2 Talmuds of the 400s to 500s, around about the same time as Justinian. And I must say, those works did very extensively progress into the law. But at the end of the day, those were works about ritual, what you worship, how you say your prayers, with a bit about purity and diet, but they really weren't about the law of contract or mercantile law or anything of that sort. Then the other great center of the law, and it was a great center of the law, were the Chinese. And the remarkable fact about the Chinese, which in fact lasted for, well, some people say last even until the present day, but certainly lasted for 1,000 years, was that they were extremely punitive. The view taken by the emperors was that in order to keep order in the empire, you had to punish people. And so it was quite a harsh system of law, and it was a list of crimes and punishments. You could say, well, Confucius was a great influence. It's no question that philosophically he was. But Confucius was a philosopher of the hierarchy, the caste system, and stability. It wasn't. If you read the Analects, it hasn't got a lot about the law of contract and what happens if there's a mistake or fraud or how you make a contract and so on. So and then there were the barbarian codes, and again those were quite crude. They borrowed quite a few elements of Roman law, copied it out, but mainly they were a list of crimes and then punishments. So there you had codes from the Visigoths, the Burgundians, the Ostrogoths, Lombards, Clovis, Anglo-Saxons, and later the Rus in Kiev under none other than Prince Vladimir. The Irish themselves also about the 600s developed an enormous amount of fantastically intricate and legalistic codes, as if they were playing Sudoku. They sort of absolutely loved imagining and speculating on all of the issues which you could have in the law, which would give rise to disputes. And there were 6 volumes of this. And so really that was about the picture. And I mean, the Roman laws by comparison were a long, long way ahead of all of those in their coverage. Early in the development of law, nobody could read any of these codes anyway. So they probably didn't take an awful lot of notice of them. And whenever there were disputes, then village elders would try and get the parties together to negotiate a compromise, to cool down people's pride and sense of insult and honor and loss, and negotiate a compromise. And kings themselves didn't have the money to have courts. So nothing was really enforced except at that sort of practical level. So not a lot happened for several hundred years, and I think that was probably true around the world, except in China. So the question is, what happened next? And this is really important because there were some huge convulsive changes in civilization. And I'll mention just a few of them because I think they really changed the picture of how we lived and how we compared to how we live now. And hence, our laws, our customs, and our codes. First of all, for most of history, since the Romans, people were farmers. They plowed their fields, they planted seeds, they irrigated it, they had fights with neighbors about cattle walking across their crops, and then they harvested them, and then if there was a surplus, they took them into the local town, if at all, and there they tried to sell it, and maybe there'd be more arguments. There were very few big cities, but where there were cities, the action went on in the cities, not in the agricultural lands around. And that situation, continued in some countries even until now. But certainly, even in Western Europe, the number of people employed in agriculture was 80, 90%, depending on the country, whereas now it's only about 1 or 2% in developed economies. So that was a massive change. So the Romans were building a system of law which was actually an urban system of law, and they were the first to do that. Of course, they recognized agriculture, but it was because of the existence of Rome as that huge capital at the top of an empire that you got this philosophical attitude to law, which they developed with enormous sophistication. I'm sure that's one of the reasons. Now, the second very, very important change in the history of humanity was the Industrial Revolution. And there's no question in my mind that that is the biggest and most life-changing revolution we have had in the entire history of human beings, except the fact, they managed to get on 2 feet and found a fire and a wheel and so on. It was just completely transforming. Electricity, engines, transportation, communications, medicine, radio waves, and later nuclear theory. And it completely changed people's lives. The second great change, all about the same time, the Industrial Revolution, about 750 to 1900, depending on the country, was the fantastic increase in population. Population of the world in 100,000 BC, at the time of one of the great ice ages, is often thought to be even as low as 20,000 people. That's not a lot. In 8000 BC, at the time of Jericho, about 10 million. At the time of Christ, about 250 million, which is less than Indonesia. But in 1830, the world achieved the first billion people. It took 100 years to get to the next billion, and then much more quickly. So that I think now billions are added on in 7 or 8 years. And we just last November had the 8 billionth birth. So that in itself it was an enormous change to our civilization and also how we think about each other. And one of the things which maybe followed from those two was the triple polarization of legal systems. So instead of just having a sort of civil law and a common law, they split up into streams of 3, which were, and I think I went through them last time. One of them was the English Anglo-American common law groups, which are now themselves divided. And the second was the Napoleonic group, based on France, about 86 jurisdictions. and then the Roman Germanic group, based on Germany, Netherlands, and Switzerland, which is quite a small group. But if you add the mixed group of the two, then which are China, Japan, Channel Islands, Panama, and Quebec, South Africa, and a few others, then you will find that those three foundational groups, the law of about 90% of the world's jurisdictions is based on them, about 84% of the land area of the world, and somewhere between 85 and 90% of GDP and population come from those three foundational groups. And that itself was an enormous change. And they're quite different, as we all know, as I pointed out in my recent book on governing law risk, where I did a sort of analysis of what the differences were. It's quite clear that there are enormous differences to the original Roman harmonized view. Now, the fifth great change, which John mentioned, apart from there being agricultural economy, industrial revolution, population, triple polarization of legal systems, is a substantial decline, the secularization of the world. So that one of the great Roman projects seems to have wavered over the past century or so. I according to a count which I did quite a few years ago, which was extremely difficult to do, I have to say, because the statistics are really quite wobbly. The mega religions, which are about level pegging, are Islam and Christianity. And I calculated on a strict definition of those religions that you had about 10% of the population Christian and about 10% of the world population were Islamic. Then there's the Hindu religion, which is not really an international religion. It's more a cultural philosophy, if you like, of India. It's mainly in India. And then all of the other religions are actually quite small. Buddhism, in its type of religion, which believes in the supernatural, because the original Buddhism was not a supernatural religion. It was a philosophic way of life. It's about 3% of the world believe in the supernatural version now. And all of the other religions I thought could be as low as 2% of world population. So the overall number of people who are truly religious, in the sense they believe in a God who knows them, and in the sense that they believe in that they have a soul which either transmigrates, as in the Eastern religions, or else goes to heaven. The number of people who believe that and who practice the religion more than just observing the great festivals like Diwali and Christmas and Easter and so on, was about 25% of the world population. But those figures are extremely wobbly, and there's much controversy about whether that's right or not, which I think is largely definitional of what is a religion. Anyway, now let's just look at some of the effects of those enormous changes and what they did to this great legal tradition. Well, first of all, it's obvious that the Roman religion, which became the religion in Europe, and because of the Great Divide, the way in which around 1830, the Western nations moved away economically and technologically, I'm not saying morally, but technologically, they moved away from the rest of the world. That also coincided with their spread around the world, and they took their religion with them. So the religion had a fantastic boost from the fact that it was a Roman religion, because this was the religion which was the religion of the imperialists, and it was also the religion which was copied and borrowed, and still continues to be borrowed by other countries. For instance, when the Russian Empire broke up, most of the borrowings were from the West, as is still the case. But the second effect, there was a spectacular increase in the scope of the law. In other words, the concepts which the Romans had developed in 533 now were enormously added to. So you had companies. I know the Romans had a sort of a partnership, which sort of had a legal personality, but basically they thought in terms of individuals. Companies arrived on the scene, and that transformed economics and commercial life. Secondly, at the time of the Romans, there was little bits of regulation, but not much. But regulation has completely taken over the world, uncontrollable, unmanageable. And part of that is because of the rise of population, people being crammed together, and in particular, the rise of cities, where you have to have massive amounts of administrative regulation just to deal with cities, from transport to housing to food, everything becomes regulated. The other development, the third development, was in constitutional rule. Of course, in the old days, there were democracies of the sort in Greece, and there were sort of democratic principles operating in Rome. But now the growth of the ideas of democracy and human rights and constitutional law is enormous. And then next, the development of tort law has been massive, particularly in negligence. In the old days, tort was considered a sort of offshoot of the criminal law, and you had a system of compensation, but not in Roman law, because Roman law had already worked out that there was a separate system of non-voluntary obligations, which they called delict. So another effect is the massive size of the law now, which is completely, to me, unmanageable and uncontrollable. I used to think that compared to 1830, where you could count the size of the Napoleonic Code, you could count the size of the US tax code, which I think was only 40 pages in those days. Now, I used to think it was about 10,000. We multiplied by about 10,000. But actually, I think it's more like 100,000. But I don't know how you count. How do you count overlaps? How do you count cases? So a methodology is not really available. But I think most people feel that they are just operating in a very narrow little speciality, because the large firms now have to offer those specialities, and they don't really get to know other areas as well. The next change was, of course, the incredible increase in money around, sloshing around in banks and corporations and funds, so that the GDP, which is an expression of the work and labor of the people, there were 3 football fields of GDP of 10 trillion each in 1993. Now there are 7, perhaps 8. And so a huge growth in what are financial atoms, financial assets such as money and investment. And indeed, most of the lives of lawyers in big firms like A&O deal in financial assets. What's the difference between ordinary assets like goods and land? Well, financial assets, sometimes I think goods and land don't really care whether we're here or not. I'm not too sure. We love our cars and things, but do they love us? But in the case of financial assets, it's the only asset. You have to have 2 people to create the asset, a lender and a borrower, a company and a shareholder. And so there's no asset. The asset itself is invisible, and the asset is formed by the 2 people. So the whole fascination of dealing with that kind of asset is that these are people with all of their emotions who circle each other with a mixture of admiration and suspicion, and one somehow has to get them to agree to their deals, which gives rise to all of the trouble. So really, those are some of the effects. Now, I've got some questions, which I'll close with those in a couple of minutes. The first is, why did the triple polarization happen? Why did you get a sort of the equivalent of a Catholic Protestant split, and then a splintering again of various sects in Christianity, and similarly in Islam? Well, my view is there are all the usual reasons about culture and history and all of this, which are quite indelible. But the main reason was in my view, the crystallization of these legal systems according to the timing of the arrival of the Industrial Revolution in their country. So France was out first, before the Industrial Revolution, had got into the minds of the people who were drafting the codes, long before that. Whereas in the case of the English, they'd already been through the Industrial Revolution, so capital was king and the railways must be built and the invisible hand of the markets and all of that. So, and their legal system crystallized after the Industrial Revolution had happened in Britain, but completely the opposite in France, whereas Germany was in about the middle. They crystallized their system finally in the later years of the 19th century and promulgated their laws into 1900, their codes. They had been through the Industrial Revolution, but the codes were drafted by Roman lawyers who were quite conservative in what they thought Roman law was, but in some cases I think we're wrong, like the trust. For instance, the Romans did have a trust and a commercial trust, but it just got forgotten round about in the 19th century by the Germans and the French for some reason. So that was one reason for this, the difference between legal systems. And another was, I think, the 1968 factor. The 1968 factor, when there was a revolution in society in all sorts of different ways, but one of them was in politics. It was at the height of another revolution which happened in the law, beginning in 1848 with Karl Marx, and then developed in 1917, the Russian Revolution, which finally died in the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989, so some say. And that was a non-law ideology. But in 1968, it was an extremely important ideology in societies. And you could say that one reason perhaps that French law was a bit shifted to the left at that time was because of the 1968 factor. But I think that remains to be proved, to be honest. Now, the second question for me is a much bigger question. What is going to happen about the boundaries between law and morality? We certainly know that the Song, for instance, who were a dynasty in China from about 900 to 1279, many of their punishments were based upon what people were thinking. And indeed, that was a tradition which has been followed by Puritanism, by the Cultural Revolution in 68 in China, and to some extent by culture wars now. And in England, where there are administrative punishments effectively for asthmas, where the law is beginning to take over the territory which had been vacated by religions, because religions dealt to a great deal with people's private lives, their conduct, their ethics, what they thought, their sense of revenge, their wickedness, which the law doesn't deal with, just in case we all go to jail. But so I think there is a question as to how that vacuum is going to be filled. And then the third question for me is, are we doomed? Are we doomed? Is the collapse of religion, and is it the unmanageability of our legal systems and our inability to sort of keep control, because the people don't really know what's going on? Is that going to lead to a breakdown of morality? And are we observing some of the basic canons, say about the law of war, which was developed by Grotius and others? And then after the question about are we doomed, apart from the wandering asteroid, which has got lost somewhere in the universe and is heading for us, quite honestly, I think I personally am a very optimistic person, but it could happen. So my conclusions is that Roman law was not perfect, but it was a massive advance in the development of law as an ideology. And it's amazing the extent to which it still is the major influence on our legal systems. Second conclusion is that law as an ideology, it exists independently of the sovereign state. For example, Britain is the custodian of English law, and England looks after its laws for the international business community, who have a sort of shadow vote on our legal system. And the third is that law is a common endeavor. And in that sense, it's like religion. The great religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, and Sikhism, and all of the others didn't rely on tribal identities at all. They weren't tribalistic. They weren't driven to any great extent by patriotism or jingoism or chauvinism or anything of that sort, or the level of wealth or development of a country. So it's a common endeavor. So I personally, I know people have many different views about this. I believe that our legal systems are a reflection of ideologies which are not in some way related to identity of a nation, but are a common inheritance of mankind. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for that session. We've had some questions come through that I hope I can put to you. The first one is, what about Jewish religious law, which seems to have been quite detailed and extensive? Who would like to take that one?
Is that for me?
Yes, that's for Philip.
Well, to tell you the truth, certainly, I mean, I've read the Pentateuch, you know, the Torah, when I was at school. And Ezekiel, is it Ezekiel? Had quite a lot of extensive rules about what you eat, and similar rules about family and inheritance and so on, and who you could marry. But I'm told that by the time you get to the Talmuds, particularly under the influence of Maimonides, they were very extensive, highly developed system of contract law. But I don't believe, and again, I'm not a historian of those books. I don't believe that they're anything like as comprehensive as the modern legal systems, which are enormous and extreme, the most comprehensive set of our credentials that we've got. And of course, they didn't, the Jewish books were for Jews. It tended to be for Jews only. It wasn't spread universally. The great achievement of the Jews in religion was actually via Christianity and Paul, which spread to an enormous degree.
Thank you. Would you say that it was the Greeks or the Eastern Romans who played the biggest part in the early years and formation of Christian doctrine?
Okay, I'll take this. What you say may be the case, but how far would all this have got us if Emperor Constantine had not first of all recognized Christianity and then resolved a huge split in the church over whether God the Father and God the Son were one or two people, and later Emperor Theodosius recognized the Trinity? You would have had two churches at a very early stage of Christianity. And what would happen to the Trinity in each church? It was my view that it was the Trinity that resulted in Christianity underpinning Western civilization and made Christianity a world religion.
Thank you. Could you explain to what extent and how Christianity influenced or contributed to the construction of our democratic societies?
I think this is explained in Philip's recent book, Do and Think, an Allegory for Survival. Religion and law are the foundations of Western civilization, and with this secure base, democracy can be built on this. This enables a person to do and think to survive, so he can try to understand and achieve as much as possible. So at the end of the day, he considers his life as being worthwhile.
Thank you, John. Have you read Trial of Socrates by I.F. Stone? Although this is not the subject, to what extent Greek legal concepts influenced Roman law, in particular regarding fair litigation?
The Greeks made a huge contribution to civilization, e.g. literature, architecture, philosophy, and the Romans copied Greek culture, but not with regards to law. The Greeks were more into jurisprudence than law. The Romans were practical people. They were more into central heating lavatories than philosophy. When it came to law, they wanted something which had practical value and worked. The Greeks simply did not have anything remotely like Justinian's Digest. With regards to fair litigation, Table 2 of the 12 tables of 450 BC sets out a fair court procedure, not some airy-fairy philosophical concept.
And another question, how is it that Christianity gets over the Bible's sometimes critical views of money lending, whilst other religions have taken different paths?
Personally, I see Christianity as more of a philosophy of life that underpins civilization than getting into the nitty-gritty of Christian doctrine. Obviously, many people may disagree about this, and it is one of the large number of ideas which should have much more widespread discussion.
And another question has just come through the chat as well. Let me see if I can. Emperors, rulers, craze, and the end of empires. Would you say that the chief reason for Rome's fall was likely its overexpansion, splitting into East and West, and reliance on barbarian inculcation and manpower support, rather than autocracy gone mad? Also, is the end of the Holy Roman Empire an example of an empire, never a wholly cohesive entity like the Roman Empire, ending with no ruler's craze, rather Francis II's pragmatism and willingness to bow to the inevitable? Questions and comments there.
Okay, that's a huge question. Personally, I don't think that Rome's fall was likely, was over its expansion. I feel it was more due to what Tacitus calls ruler's craze. I mean, just think, the barbarians are rapidly Christianizing as well. If Rome was seen as the defender of Christianity, why would they want to attack the Romans? In fact, barbarians admired Roman culture. The last part of the question also is the end of the Holy Roman Empire.
Where was it? Also, is the end of the Holy Roman Empire an example of an empire, never a wholly cohesive entity like the Roman Empire, ending with no ruler's craze, rather Francis II's pragmatism and willingness to bow to the inevitable?
Philip, why don't you have a go at answering this?
Well, I was hoping I suppose one of the questions is when did the Roman Empire end? I mean, some people say it ended, the attacks of Attila in, was it 399, something like that. And most people would say 476, when Romulus Remus was deposed by the Ostrogoths. And other people say, well, actually it was 1453 when Constantinople was taken by the Seljuk Turks. Others say the Roman Empire has never ended because, what about the Senate in Rome and other analogies. But I take the date 476. And certainly, I mean, they had some terrible rulers, so the Nero, Caligula type. But one of the arguments which historians have made is that actually the rest of the empire sort of just carried on, sometimes with their absolutely insane, mad and lunatic lives and murders and massacres and shocking conduct. But the rest of the population, they had an enormous bureaucracy together with the Chinese, and the bureaucracy just carried on as normal. So that's one view. Another view is that, of course, there is the overstretched view, but the view which I tend to adhere to myself is that were the invasions. I don't think they could cope with all of the people at the borders, because it was all round, every single border, these massive people in these huge migrations, threatening their borders and demanding to be let in to become Roman citizens. They really just couldn't cope with that. And then you could say, oh, that was because the fault of the rulers, they were degenerates, and they didn't have a proper tax system. So I think you have to take into account quite a lot of factors and recognize that it perhaps wasn't just one, but a bundle of things which eventually brought them down.
Just to add a postscript, I agree with what Philip has said, but with regards to England, I'm absolutely certain of the view that we could have defeated the Saxons. And if so, we would have had a continuing Roman type state, and our history would have been totally different.
Well, I mean, when the Saxons arrived, 410, something like that, the Romans had just disappeared. They'd withdrawn the legions in order to switch them over to the Eastern Front, where most of the trouble was. And so they left the Britons there a bit demoralized. And I'm sure the Britons could have pulled themselves together, but I don't think they had sort of prepared themselves for this eventuality. They just hadn't seen it coming. I mean, again, they should have seen it coming, but it was very sudden, the way the emperor at the time just said, get the troops back from Britain and get the legions over to the east to deal with Persia and all that. I think they just weren't ready for this situation, and we're just basically very, very disorganized. But whether they had the will, the relentless desire to win, maybe. The Britons had a very, very bad time. The Anglo-Saxons got quite their comeuppance when the Vikings showed up, and they again were not very good at dealing with the Vikings, who would be. They were raiding parties that are absolutely ruthless, these guys, and they got around the world. And then when that problem was dealt with, who should arrive but the Normans? So the British were actually colonized with 3 successive waves, the Romans, then the Anglo-Saxons, and then the Normans. And they didn't actually succeed in defeating any of them. So I don't know what that tells us about our history.
Philip, another question for you that Stella can read out.
Yes, we've just had one come through, actually. Any thoughts on Euthyphro's, I hope I've said that right, dilemma from Socrates' dialogue with him? I.e., sorry. Oh,
i.e. his morality.
It's just gone down.
Shall I carry on?
I.e. his morality and by extension law, a function of the power of the gods, or are the gods themselves subject to a higher law, or is there a third option?
You deal with it. That's not for me, is it?
I don't think it's for me.
No, that's for you.
Whoever wants to take it.
Yeah, I mean, this is outside my remit, so I couldn't really comment on this question.
Okay.
People do have some kind of instinct about what the law should be certainly on very basic subjects like murder, theft, and so on. And that's I think built into us. That's natural law, if you like. I don't think you have to necessarily posit to God for that. It just seems to be built in us evolutionarily, quite apart from the teachings of our society as we grow up. Whether we also seem to have a very pronounced sense of justice about what's right and what's wrong. Often our sense of justice and what should be done is different, but on the whole, the sense of what's fair and how people should be treated seems to be very much part of our psychological development, no doubt formed by evolutionary methods. And so you can say that's a kind of natural law. And also there's no question, in my view, that there are some situations where the law is inadequate and where people have to take the law into their own hands. But I tend to reserve those situations to something where it really, really is absolutely atrocious what is happening. And not just the normal political argy-bargy and toing and froing which you get. So I think my answer to that, there is a natural law. You can say in terms of our psychology, we are the terrible charioteer, that the foul fiend is us, but also, the altruism and the saintliness and our desire to survive are also very important traits of humanity, and the ones which I personally am backing.
Thank you, Philip. I know that you have to leave the call. There's one more question, but I think John can take this one. How much of Thomist Aristotelian natural law is used in modern judicial judgments? Thank you, Philip.
Thank you.
We have a common law system in this country, which means legally binding case law. My experience is that civil law countries also treat cases as binding, even though legally they are not. So I fundamentally disagree with the premise of this question, that court decisions are based on ideas. They are based on prior cases. Cicero said that if civil law did not comply with divine law, then it was invalid. For divine law, read natural law, and for natural law, read a body of norms or principles inherent in all of us. I would suggest expect or acceptable conduct. So I would suggest that natural law is very important in understanding why law is voluntarily obeyed, but not in forming the basis of judgments.
Thank you, John. Okay, well, that brings us to 1 o'clock, so perfect timing. Thank you so much to everyone who's joined the session today, and we hope that you enjoyed the talk. We're really keen to receive your feedback. On your screen, very shortly will be here it is, a QR code that will direct you to a very short survey on this event. If you can open up the camera function on your phone, you can scan that code. A pop-up link will appear and it will redirect you to our short survey that takes less than a minute to complete. And your comments will really help us to shape events for the future. So that just leaves for me to say thank you so much to John and Philip for today's very informative session. Please do provide your feedback, and we will see you again very soon at our next virtual event. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.